I'm Olivia Wilson, 67, and 3 months ago, I lost my husband Marcus during a humanitarian mission in Iran. While I was still drowning in grief, my family gathered for Sunday dinner and told me it was time to get over it and move on with my life. Their cruelty shattered what was left of my heart, but then, a decorated general knocked on my door with a classified envelope that would expose the truth about Marcus's death and revealed just how wrong my family had been about everything. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt abandoned by those who should love you most, like this video for a story of devastating loss, family, betrayal, and the shocking truth that changed everything. Marcus and I met in 1982 when I was 25 and he was 27. I was a newly minted high school English teacher, and he was a young army officer with kind eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Our first date was a disaster. He took me to a fancy restaurant where he couldn't afford the wine, and I spilled marinara sauce on my best dress. We laughed about it for 42 years. I still wear his wedding ring on a chain around my neck. It's a simple gold band, worn thin from decades of his hands building our life together, teaching our children to ride bikes, holding mine through 3 miscarriages, applauding at school plays, and wiping away tears during the hardest moments of raising a family. We had 3 children, David in 1985, Jennifer in 1987, and Robert in 1990. In those early years, our house was chaos, beautiful, exhausting chaos. Marcus would come home from his military assignments, and within minutes, he'd be on the floor with the kids, building forts out of couch cushions or reading bedtime stories in different voices that made them giggle until their sides hurt. I remember thinking we had it all figured out. Marcus transitioned from active duty to humanitarian work when David turned 10, saying he wanted to serve but also be present for his family. "I've seen enough of what war does to families," he told me one night as we watched our children sleep. "I want to help rebuild what's been broken." For years, our dining room table was command central for his missions. Maps spread across the oak surface, marked with locations where he'd helped build schools, distribute medical supplies, or coordinate refugee assistance. The children would do their homework around his planning sessions, and somehow, it all worked. We were a team, but somewhere along the way, things shifted. The children grew up and moved away, starting their own lives, their own families. Marcus and I thought this was natural. We'd raise them to be independent. What we didn't expect was how distant they'd become, not just geographically, but emotionally. Phone calls became shorter. Visits became obligatory rather than joyful. Holiday gatherings felt strained, as if they were checking items off a duty list rather than celebrating family. Marcus tried to bridge the gap. He'd call David every Sunday, asking about work, about the grandchildren's soccer games. He'd remember Jennifer's anniversary and send flowers. He'd help Robert with career advice and loan him money when needed, money that was never repaid or acknowledged. "They're busy, Liv," Marcus would say. When I expressed concern about the growing distance, "They'll come around. Family always does." I wanted to believe him, but I could see the hurt in his eyes when calls went unreturned, when grandchildren's birthdays were celebrated without us, when our children seemed more comfortable with their in-laws than with the people who'd raised them. Still, Marcus never stopped trying. He never stopped believing in the family we'd built. The irony wasn't lost on me that a man who'd spent his career helping strangers across the world couldn't quite figure out how to stay close to his own children. But that was Marcus. He always believed the best in people, even when they disappointed him, especially when they disappointed him. Now, sitting in our empty house with just his wedding ring and 42 years of memories, I realized that Marcus had been my anchor in ways I'd never fully appreciated. He was the one who smoothed over family tensions, who made excuses for our children's distance, who kept believing that love would eventually win out over whatever had grown cold between us and the people we'd raised. When Marcus announced he was taking the Iran mission, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. He was 69 years old, officially retired from active humanitarian work, but the organization had called him specifically for this assignment. "They need someone with my experience," he explained over breakfast, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug, a habit he'd developed over decades of early morning deployments. "There's a refugee camp near the border. Medical supplies, educational materials, basic infrastructure support." I studied his face. looking for the excitement that usually accompanied his missions. Instead, I saw something I'd rarely seen in Marcus's uncertainty, maybe even fear. "You don't have to go," I said quietly. "You've given enough." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Liv, there are children there who need clean water and medical care. If I can help make that happen, how can I say no?" That was Marcus. Even at 69, even when his body was starting to show the wear of decades of service, he couldn't turn away from people in need. The night before he left, Marcus sat at his desk writing what I now know was his final letter home. I watched him from the doorway, noting how carefully he chose each word, how many times he stopped to look at our wedding photo on his desk. "What are you writing?" I asked. "Just some thoughts," he said, folding the letter and placing it in his desk drawer, "in case something happens. You know how these missions can be unpredictable." I should have pressed him. I should have asked why this mission felt different. Instead, I kissed the top of his head and went to pack his suitcase, focusing on practical things like ensuring he had enough of his blood pressure medication and his favorite granola bars. Our last conversation was at the airport. Marcus held me longer than usual, his face buried in my hair. "I love you, Olivia Wilson," he whispered. "Whatever happens, remember that everything I've done has been worth it because it led me to you." "Don't talk like that," I said, pulling back to look at him. "You're going to help those people and come home to me, just like you always do." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course I am." 3 weeks later, I received the call. A representative from the humanitarian organization, speaking in the careful, practiced tone of someone who'd delivered this news before. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm calling about your husband Marcus. I'm sorry to inform you that he suffered a cardiac event while serving in Iran. He was transported to a medical facility, but despite all efforts, he couldn't be revived." The words seemed to come from very far away. Cardiac event, medical facility, couldn't be revived. "I don't understand," I said. "Marcus was healthy. He just had a physical. His heart was fine." "Mrs. Wilson, I know this is difficult. The stress of humanitarian work, especially in challenging environments, can sometimes trigger unexpected medical events. Your husband died serving others, which I know would have meant a great deal to him. The funeral arrangements were handled efficiently by the organization. A closed casket ceremony. They explained that given the circumstances and the international transport, it was necessary. The service was respectful but somehow sterile, filled with official condolences and formal acknowledgments of Marcus's service. What struck me most was how little I actually knew about his final weeks. The organization provided minimal details. He'd been working with refugee families, helping coordinate medical care, assisting with educational programs for children. Standard humanitarian work, they assured me. Nothing unusual or dangerous, but something felt wrong. Marcus had always been meticulous about communication during his missions. He'd email regularly, call when possible, send photos of the people he was helping. This time, I'd received only 3 brief messages over 3 weeks, each one oddly formal and lacking the warmth and detail that characterized his usual correspondence. When I mentioned this to the organization representative, he explained that communication infrastructure in the region was limited, and Marcus had been particularly focused on his work. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't ease the nagging feeling that something important was being left unsaid. The Sunday dinner happened 3 months after Marcus's funeral, and I can still see the family photo on my mantel that was taken just 5 years earlier, all of us laughing at something Robert had said. Marcus's arm around my shoulders, our children and their families gathered close. Looking at it now, I wonder when exactly everything changed. David called that morning to check in, though his tone suggested obligation rather than concern. "Mom, we're worried about you," he said without preamble. "Jennifer and Robert think you need to start getting out more. Maybe join a grief support group or something." "I'm managing fine," I replied, though I wasn't sure that was entirely true. 3 months of mostly solitary grieving had left me raw and uncertain. "That's just it, Mom. You're not managing. You barely leave the house. You don't answer the phone half the time. This isn't healthy." I wanted to explain that grief doesn't follow a schedule, that 3 months isn't some magical threshold where pain disappears and normal life resumes. But David had always been impatient with emotions, even as a child. "Why don't you come for dinner Sunday?" he continued. "Jennifer and Robert will be there with their families. It'll be good for you to be around people." I should have declined. Something in his tone warned me that this wasn't just a family dinner, but I missed my grandchildren, and part of me hoped that being together would help us all process Marcus's loss as a family. Jennifer's house was as pristine as always, every surface gleaming, every decoration perfectly placed. She greeted me with the kind of hug that looks warm from a distance but feels perfunctory up close. "Mom, you look thin," she said, though her tone suggested criticism rather than concern. "Are you eating properly?" Before I could answer, Robert appeared with his wife Sarah and their 2 children. He kissed my cheek dutifully and immediately launched into a story about his latest business venture, as if normal conversation could somehow erase the elephant in the room. David arrived last with his family, and for a few minutes, the chaos of grandchildren and dinner preparations created the illusion of a normal family gathering, but I could feel the undercurrent of tension. The way my adult children exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Dinner conversation felt forced. Jennifer talked about her latest charity board appointment. David discussed his promotion at the law firm. Robert described his plans to expand his consulting business. No one mentioned Marcus, as if he'd simply never existed. Finally, over dessert, David cleared his throat in the way he'd done since childhood when he had something important to say. "Mom, we need to talk about your situation." "My situation." I set down my fork, suddenly understanding why I'd been invited. "You can't keep living in the past," Jennifer said, her voice taking on the tone she used with her children when they misbehaved. "Dad has been gone for 3 months. At some point, you need to accept reality and move forward. It's not healthy." "All this wallowing," Robert added, apparently emboldened by his siblings' directness. "Dad wouldn't want you sitting around feeling sorry for yourself." The word wallowing hit me like a physical blow. I looked around the table at these people I'd raised, nursed through illnesses, cheered at graduations, celebrated at weddings. When had they become so cold? "I'm not wallowing," I said quietly. "I'm grieving my husband of 42 years. There's a difference between grieving and refusing to participate in life," David said. "You've missed Emma's soccer games. You didn't come to Robert's business launch. You barely spoke at Jennifer's charity gala. Maybe because my husband just died, and attending social events hasn't been my priority." "See, that's exactly what we're talking about," Jennifer said, leaning forward. With the intensity she brought to her various causes, "You're using Dad's death as an excuse to withdraw from everything and everyone. It's been 3 months, Mom. People expect you to start functioning again." "People expect," I repeated. "What people?" "Friends, neighbors, the family," Robert said. "Everyone's asking about you, wondering when you're going to get back to normal." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "And what did you tell these people?" "That we're concerned," David said, "that you seem to be having trouble moving on." "Moving on," I said the words, slowly, tasting their bitterness, from the man who was my partner for 4 decades, the father of my children. "Your father." "Of course, we loved Dad," Jennifer said quickly, "but life has to continue. You're 67, Mom. You could have 20 good years ahead of you. If you don't waste them sitting around feeling sorry for yourself." The cruelty of it took my breath away. These were my children, the people who should have understood my pain better than anyone. Instead, they were treating my grief like an inconvenience, my love for their father like a character flaw. "Get over it, Mom," Robert said with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never experienced real loss. "Dad's gone. Nothing you do is going to bring him back." I looked around the table one more time, at their expectant faces, at my grandchildren who were suddenly too interested in their dessert to meet my eyes. For the first time since Marcus's death, I felt completely, utterly alone. 2 days after that devastating dinner, I was sitting in Marcus's study, surrounded by the remnants of his life, his books, his maps, his carefully organized files from decades of humanitarian work when the doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer it. Since Marcus's death, I'd been avoiding unexpected visitors, letting calls go to voicemail, allowing the world to exist at a distance. But something made me get up and walk to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a man in military dress, uniform, his posture straight despite what appeared to be advanced age. He held a manila envelope in his hands, and wore the kind of expression that suggested serious business. "Mrs. Wilson," he said when I opened the door. "My name is General Morrison. I served with your husband Marcus on several occasions. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." His voice carried the weight of authority but also something else, respect. perhaps even reverence. It was such a stark contrast to my children's dismissive tones that I found myself stepping aside to let him in. General Morrison was probably in his 70s, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that comes from a lifetime of military service. But what struck me most were his eyes, kind, intelligent, and filled with what I could only describe as genuine sorrow. "I should have come sooner," he said as we settled in the living room. "I've been wrestling with whether this visit was appropriate, given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" I asked, though something in his tone made me suspect this wasn't a routine condolence call. He looked around the room, taking in the photos of Marcus, the mementos from his various missions, the life we'd built together. "Your husband was an exceptional man, Mrs. Wilson. In my 40 years of military and humanitarian service, I've rarely encountered someone with this combination of courage, compassion, and integrity." I felt tears threaten. It had been so long since anyone had spoken about Marcus with genuine admiration, instead of the perfunctory respect typically offered to the dead. "Thank you," I managed. "He would have appreciated hearing that from you." "General," Morrison leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Wilson, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll forgive the personal nature of the question. How are you managing? Do you have support from family and friends?" The question caught me off guard. "I'm managing," I said automatically, then found myself being more honest. "Actually, I'm struggling. My children think I should be over it by now. They seem to believe 3 months is sufficient time to grieve a 42-year marriage." Something shifted in the general's expression, anger, perhaps, or disappointment. "They said that to you?" "They said quite a lot of things, none of them particularly kind." General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him making some kind of internal decision. "Mrs. Wilson, I came here today because I believe you deserve to know the truth about your husband's death. What I'm about to share with you is classified information. But given what you've just told me about your family's response to your grief, I think you need to understand exactly who Marcus was and what he died doing." My heart began to race. "What do you mean?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out the manila envelope I'd noticed earlier. It was sealed with official-looking tape and marked with classifications I didn't recognize. The official story about Marcus's death, the cardiac event, the routine humanitarian work. That's not the complete truth. I felt the room tilt slightly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that your husband didn't die of natural causes, Mrs. Wilson. He died a hero, saving lives at the cost of his own. And the fact that his own children have dismissed your grief over such a man." He shook his head, his jaw tight with what looked like barely controlled anger. "I don't understand. Your husband's final mission wasn't routine humanitarian work. He volunteered for something far more dangerous, something that required his specific skills and experience. And when the moment came, he made a choice that saved 30 innocent lives." He held up the envelope. "Everything is documented in here. Medical reports, witness statements, commendations from both the U.S. government and the Iranian authorities. Your husband died a hero, Mrs. Wilson. Not just any hero, man, whose actions prevented an international incident and saved dozens of families." I stared at the envelope, my hands shaking. Why wasn't I told? Political sensitivities, diplomatic concerns, the kind of bureaucratic calculations that put policy ahead of human decency. His voice carried decades of frustration with such decisions. "But after 40 years of service, I've decided that some things matter more than classification levels. You have the right to know who you married, who you lost, and why your grief is not just justified but sacred." He stood and placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. "Take your time reading this. When you're ready, if you have questions, my contact information is inside. And Mrs. Wilson, yes, the next time anyone suggests you should get over the loss of a man like Marcus Wilson, you tell them they clearly never understood who he was in the first place." I sat staring at the classified envelope for nearly an hour after General Morrison left, afraid to open it, afraid of what I might find inside. Finally, with trembling hands, I broke the seal. The first document was a medical examiner's report, clinical and precise. Cause of death: multiple trauma injuries, consistent with explosion. Time of death: 14:23 local time. Location: refugee camp medical facility, 2.3 kilometers from Iranian border. Explosion: not a heart attack, not a peaceful death in a medical bed, but violence and chaos and terror. The next document was a mission briefing, stamped with classifications I'd never seen before. Marcus hadn't been assigned to routine humanitarian work. He'd volunteered for an emergency extraction mission when intelligence suggested a planned bombing at the refugee camp. Subject Wilson requested immediate deployment despite standard age restrictions, the report noted. His extensive regional experience and language capabilities made him uniquely qualified for rapid civilian evacuation protocols. I had to stop reading and walk to the kitchen, my hands shaking too badly to hold the papers steady. Marcus spoke 4 languages fluently, something I'd always admired but never fully appreciated the implications of. Now I understood why they called him specifically. The witness statements were the hardest to read. A camp administrator named Dr. Sarah Chen described the morning of Marcus's death in devastating detail. At approximately 14:15, Wilson identified suspicious activity near the children's education tent. Instead of evacuating, he made the decision to enter the area and begin emergency civilian removal. When the device detonated, Wilson was shielding a group of 12 children and 3 adults with his own body. His actions prevented what would have been catastrophic casualties among the camp's most vulnerable population. Another witness, a nurse named Hassan Rabbani, provided additional context. Wilson had been working 18-hour days since his arrival. When we received intelligence about potential threats, most international staff were evacuated. Wilson volunteered to remain and coordinate civilian protection protocols. In my 30 years of humanitarian work, I have never seen such selfless courage. The Iranian government's secret commendation letter was perhaps the most shocking document in the file. It was addressed to the U.S. State Department, praising Marcus's actions and requesting permission to award him their highest civilian honor for protecting Iranian refugees. Mr. Wilson's sacrifice prevented not only massive loss of life, but also the international incident that such casualties would have created. The letter stated, "His actions represent the highest ideals of humanitarian service and have earned the eternal gratitude of the Islamic Republic of Iran." But it was the final document that broke my heart completely, a letter from Marcus himself, written to General Morrison before the mission began. "General, if something happens to me, please ensure Olivia knows the truth, not the sanitized version that will be fed to her for political reasons, but the actual truth about why I chose this mission and what it meant to accomplish. She deserves to understand that every risk I've taken in my career has been calculated and purposeful. This mission could save dozens of lives and prevent a diplomatic crisis that would harm thousands more. If I don't come home, she needs to know it was worth it. She needs to know I died doing exactly what I was meant to do." I clutched the letter to my chest and sobbed for Marcus, for the children he'd saved, for the truth that had been hidden from me, and for my own children who had dismissed my grief over such an extraordinary man. The official cover-up made sense now. In the coldest political terms, Marcus's death during a classified operation, especially one involving Iranian civilians, could have created diplomatic complications during an already tense period. It was easier to report a heart attack, file the paperwork, and move on. But the cost of that convenience was my right to understand my husband's legacy, my right to grieve appropriately, and my right to honor his memory with the full truth of his sacrifice. Marcus hadn't just died. He'd chosen to die protecting innocent people. He'd looked at a group of children and made a split-second decision that his life was worth less than theirs. And when the explosion came, he'd used his own body as a shield. I thought about my children's words at dinner. Get over it. Move on. Stop wallowing. They had no idea, none at all, what kind of man their father had been, or what kind of death he'd died. They'd reduced him to a simple humanitarian worker who'd suffered an unfortunate medical event, when the truth was that he'd died performing one of the most heroic acts imaginable. I spent the rest of the evening reading and rereading every document, memorizing every detail, understanding for the first time the full scope of what I'd lost and what the world had lost when Marcus Wilson made his final choice. The next morning, I called General Morrison. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been expecting my call. "Mrs. Wilson, I trust you've had time to review the materials. I have questions," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "So many questions. I imagined you would. May I come over?" Some things are better discussed in person. An hour later, we sat in my kitchen while I made coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. The classified documents were spread across the table between us like pieces of a puzzle I was still trying to assemble. "The Iranian commendation letter," I began. "They wanted to honor Marcus." General Morrison nodded. "Not only honor him, but make his actions public. They saw his sacrifice as a bridge between our countries, proof that Americans and Iranians could work together to protect innocent life. The Iranian president himself signed that letter, but it was classified, buried. More accurately, the State Department decided that public recognition would draw attention to the classified nature of the operation. They were worried about Senate hearings, media investigations, questions about why we had assets in that region during such a sensitive time. I stared at the letter, written in both Farsi and English, expressing gratitude I'd never known existed. What were the children's names? The ones Marcus saved. General Morrison pulled out a small notebook. I thought you might ask. There were 15 children and 18 adults in the immediate blast radius. The youngest child was 4 years old, a little girl named Zara. The oldest was 16, a boy named Omar, who was helping teach the younger children basic English. He recited each name slowly, and I wrote them down. These strangers, whose lives had cost me my husband and whose survival had given his death meaning. The camp administrators wanted to name the rebuilt medical facility after Marcus, he continued, the Wilson Memorial Clinic, but again, diplomatic concerns prevented any public acknowledgement, so he saved all these people, and no one can ever know. Officially, no one can ever know. Unofficially, he paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. There are ways to honor a man's legacy without compromising national security interests. I looked up sharply. What do you mean? Your husband wasn't the first person to die in a classified operation, Mrs. Wilson. There are families across this country who've been told their loved ones died in training accidents, equipment failures, medical emergencies, all because the truth was deemed too sensitive for public consumption. That's horrible. It's necessary, sometimes, but it's also wrong when it leaves families like you, isolated in your grief, unable to understand the magnitude of what you've lost. He leaned forward. Marcus specifically asked that you be told the truth. Not immediately. He understood operational security requirements, but eventually, that's why I'm here. I picked up another document I'd studied the night before. This medical report mentions that Marcus was conscious when they first reached him. General Morrison's expression grew heavy. He was, for about 10 minutes. What did he say? Are you sure you want to know? I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. He asked about the children first. When they told him everyone in his group had survived, he smiled. Then he asked them to tell you that he loved you and that this was exactly how he wanted his story to end, protecting people who needed protection. Tears ran down my cheeks, but for the first time since Marcus's death, they weren't tears of pure grief. They were tears of pride, of love, of overwhelming respect for the man I'd been married to for 42 years. There's something else, General Morrison said gently. The Iranian families Marcus saved, they've been asking about you. They want to express their gratitude, to share their children's stories, to help you understand the impact of your husband's sacrifice. They know about me. The local authorities shared Marcus's story within the refugee community. To them, he's not a classified operation. He's the American who died to save their children. They've created a small memorial in the camp, flowers and photos and letters from the families. Unofficial, of course, but deeply felt. I thought about my children's dismissive words, their impatience with my grief, their complete ignorance of who their father had been. General Morrison, what would happen if I told people the truth? Not the classified details, but the basic facts that Marcus died saving lives, that he was a hero. He was quiet for a long moment. Officially, I would have to discourage such disclosure. Unofficially, I think the world needs to know that men like Marcus Wilson still exist, and families like yours deserve to grieve with the full truth of what you've lost, even if it meant breaking classification rules. Mrs. Wilson, I've spent 40 years following orders and protecting national interest, but I've also spent 40 years watching good people die in silence, while their families are fed lies for convenience. Sometimes, human decency trumps bureaucratic requirements. He stood to leave, then turned back. Your husband died believing that some things matter more than regulations or political calculations. Maybe it's time his widow carried on that tradition. After General Morrison left, I went to Marcus's study and pulled out the filing cabinet where he'd kept meticulous records of his entire career. I'd avoided this room since his death, but now I needed to understand the full scope of who my husband had been. The first file contained his military service record from 1980 to 1995. commendations, efficiency reports, deployment pattern of exemplary service that I'd known about in general terms but never examined in detail. Marcus had earned 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Army Commendation Medals, and a Distinguished Service Medal, not for combat, but for humanitarian assistance during natural disasters and conflict zones. 1. Citation stood out. Captain Wilson's innovative approach to civilian evacuation during the 1994 Rwanda crisis saved an estimated 200 lives and became the template for future humanitarian military operations. 200 lives, and that was just one mission among dozens. The humanitarian work files were even more extensive: 25 years of missions across 4 continents, building schools, distributing medical supplies, coordinating refugee assistance, training local personnel in emergency response protocols. Each file contained thank you letters, photos of completed projects, and follow-up reports showing the long-term impact of his work. A letter from a school principal in Bangladesh. Mr. Wilson's work establishing our water purification system has eliminated waterborne illness in our village. Our children are healthy and attending school regularly for the first time in generations. A medical report from Kosovo. The emergency medical facility constructed under Wilson's supervision treated over 3,000 patients during the initial refugee crisis and continues to serve the community 15 years later. Photos of smiling children, rebuilt communities, families returning to homes that had been made safe through Marcus's efforts. Hundreds of faces, thousands of lives touched by his work. I found myself getting angry not at Marcus, but at my own ignorance. How had I lived with this man for 42 years and never fully grasped the scope of his impact? Yes, I'd known he was good at his job, that people respected him, that his work mattered, but seeing it all laid out systematically, I realized I'd been married to someone extraordinary and had somehow reduced him to simply my husband who travels for work. The anger deepened when I thought about my children's dismissive attitude. They'd grown up in this house, surrounded by evidence of their father's remarkable career, and somehow they'd internalized only the inconvenience of his travel schedule, not the magnitude of his service. I picked up my phone and called David. Mom, is everything okay? I want to talk to you about your father. A sigh. Mom, we've been through this. We all loved Dad, but did you know he saved 200 people during the Rwanda crisis? Silence. Did you know he built 43 schools in 7 countries? That he established water systems that are still serving communities 20 years later? That medical facilities he helped create have treated tens of thousands of patients? Mom, where is this coming from? I'm in your father's study, looking at his service records, really looking at them for the first time. David, your father wasn't just a nice man who did good work. He was extraordinary. He was a genuine hero, and I let you dismiss my grief over losing him as if he were just any random person. I never said Dad wasn't a good person. You told me to get over it. You said I was wallowing. You suggested that 3 months was sufficient time to grieve a 42-year marriage to a man who spent his entire adult life saving other people's lives. Another long pause. Mom, I think grief might be affecting your perspective. My perspective is just fine. David, it's your perspective I'm questioning. When was the last time any of you asked me about your father's work? When was the last time you showed any interest in understanding who he was beyond your childhood memories of him being gone a lot? That's not fair, isn't it? I'm looking at thank you letters from people whose lives your father saved, and I'm trying to reconcile that with my children telling me to move on from losing him. I could hear David's discomfort through the phone. What do you want from us, Mom? I want you to understand that when you dismiss my grief, you're dismissing your father's legacy. I want you to realize that your impatience with my mourning reflects poorly on your understanding of what kind of man raised you. Mom, I'm not finished. David, I want you to think about the fact that while you've been worried about me embarrassing the family with my grief, your father died doing something so heroic that foreign governments wanted to honor him. What are you talking about? I almost told him about Iran, about the classified documents, about the children Marcus died protecting, but something held me back, not secrecy concerns, but a growing realization that my children would have to earn the right to know the full truth about their father. I'm talking about reevaluating your assumptions, David, about considering that maybe your father deserves more respect than you've been showing his memory, and maybe his widow deserves more compassion than you've been offering. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking with a mixture of grief and righteous anger. For the first time since Marcus's death, I felt something other than pure sadness. I felt protective of his memory, indignant on his behalf, and determined to ensure that his legacy received the respect it deserved, even if that meant confronting my own children's callousness. David called back 20 minutes later, and I could hear the irritation in his voice before he even spoke. Mom, I just talked to Jennifer and Robert. They're concerned about this conversation we had. Are they now? Yes, they are. We all are. This sudden obsession with Dad's work records, these accusations about how we've treated his memory, it sounds like you're having some kind of breakdown. I felt something cold settle in my chest. A breakdown. We think grief counseling might help. There are support groups for widows, professional therapists who specialize in loss. David, stop talking. Mom, I said stop. My voice was calm, but underneath I felt 42 years of maternal patience finally reaching its limit. Let me ask you something. Do you remember your father helping you with your science fair project when you were 12? What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember it? A pause. Yes. Tell me about it. Mom, this is ridiculous. Humor me. Another sigh. It was about water purification. Dad helped me build a filtration system using sand and charcoal and cloth. We won second place. Do you remember what your father told you that night after the science fair? Silence. He said that clean water was one of the most basic human needs, and that understanding how to purify it could someday help you save lives. He said that knowledge was only valuable if you used it to help other people. I remember. Your father wasn't just helping you with homework, David. He was teaching you his core values. The same values that led him to spend his career providing clean water systems to communities that didn't have them. Okay, but I don't see the filtration system he taught you to build. He built hundreds of them. Real ones, in refugee camps and disaster zones and impoverished communities. Children are alive today because your father understood water purification and cared enough to share that knowledge. David was quiet. Now, you want me to get counseling because I'm obsessed with his work records? You think there's something wrong with me for wanting to understand the full scope of what I lost when I lost him? Mom, that's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. You're so uncomfortable with my grief that you'd rather pathologize it than examine whether your own response to your father's death has been adequate. I could hear him breathing, could picture him in his law office, probably checking his watch, probably wishing this conversation would end so he could get back to his real life. I got a text from you yesterday, I continued. Do you remember what it said? You know, hope you're doing better. Try to get out of the house today. 30 seconds of effort. David, that's what your father's death merited from his eldest son. A text message suggesting I take a walk. I'm busy, Mom. I've got clients, responsibilities. Your father had responsibilities too, enormous ones. Life and death responsibilities that he handled while still managing to be present for his family, still making time for science fair projects and bedtime stories and teaching moments. That's not fair. You can't compare, can't I? Your father saved hundreds of lives while still being an involved parent. You can't manage a 5-minute phone call to check on your grieving mother. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unspoken disappointments and unexamined assumptions. What do you want from me, Mom? David finally asked, and for the first time in the conversation, he sounded genuinely uncertain rather than irritated. I want you to consider that maybe your impatience with my grief says more about you than it does about me. I want you to think about whether your father would be proud of how you've supported his widow. And I want you to stop suggesting that there's something wrong with me for loving him enough to be devastated by losing him. I never said there was anything wrong with loving Dad. You said I was having a breakdown because I spent an afternoon reading about his career accomplishments. You suggested professional help because I objected to being told to get over the loss of an extraordinary man. Mom, I'm not finished. Your father spent his life helping people who needed help. His widow needs help now. Needs support and patience and understanding. Instead, his children are treating his death like an inconvenience and his wife's grief like a character defect. I could hear David's chair creaking, could imagine him running his hands through his hair the way he'd done since childhood, when he was frustrated. We're not trying to be cruel, Mom. We just think that at some point, at what point, David? 6 months, a year, 5 years? When exactly does love become pathological in your professional opinion? He didn't answer. Here's what I think, son. I think you're uncomfortable with grief because it's messy and inconvenient and doesn't follow corporate timelines. I think you'd rather I pretend to be fine than actually support me through being broken. and I think your father would be deeply disappointed in all of you." After hanging up on David, I sat in Marcus's study feeling both exhausted and energized. The conversation had clarified something important. My children weren't going to understand who their father had been unless I made them understand. And that meant I needed more than just his service records. I opened my laptop and began searching for news coverage of the Iran incident. If Marcus had died preventing a bombing, if 30 people had been saved, surely there would be some trace in the media, even if the details were obscured for security reasons. It took hours of searching, using terms like Iran refugee camp, border incident, and humanitarian casualties, but eventually I found a brief Reuters report from 3 months ago. Tehran. Iranian officials reported a contained security incident at a refugee facility near the Iraq border yesterday, resulting in 1 civilian casualty. The incident caused no disruption to ongoing humanitarian operations, according to government sources. No additional details were provided. 1 civilian casualty. Marcus, reduced to a footnote in a news brief that revealed nothing about his heroism or sacrifice. I searched deeper, finding 3 more references to the incident in various international publications. Each was similarly brief and uninformative, clearly based on limited official statements. But reading between the lines, I could see the shape of a larger story being deliberately obscured. A piece in The Guardian mentioned enhanced security protocols being implemented at refugee facilities along the Iranian border following recent concerns about extremist activity. Another article in Foreign Policy discussed the delicate diplomatic balance required for international humanitarian work in the region, noting that even minor security incidents can have far-reaching political implications. Minor security incident. The explosion that killed my husband and could have killed 30 others was being characterized as minor. I found myself thinking about General Morrison's words about other families dealing with classified operations. How many widows and widowers were sitting alone, confused by vague official explanations that didn't match the magnitude of their loss. On impulse, I typed classified military operation families into the search engine. The results were heartbreaking. Support forums for families of service members killed in training accidents that were clearly something more. Blog posts by spouses seeking answers about deaths that made no sense. Articles about the psychological toll of incomplete information on grieving families. One blog post particularly caught my attention, written by a woman named Patricia Martinez, whose Navy SEAL husband had allegedly died in a diving accident during a routine training exercise. Her post, titled "When Training Accident Means We Can't Tell You the Truth," described years of confusion and anger over official explanations that didn't match her husband's experience level or the circumstances of his death. "They told me he ran out of air during a basic dive," she wrote. "My husband was a master diver with 15 years of experience. He could hold his breath for 4 minutes and had never had an equipment failure in his career. But when I asked questions, I was told that sometimes even experts make fatal mistakes. It wasn't until 3 years later that someone finally told me he'd died on a classified mission rescuing hostages in Somalia. I found her contact information and, before I could second-guess myself, sent her an email. Patricia, I read your blog post about your husband's death. I think I'm going through something similar. My husband was told to have died of a heart attack during humanitarian work. But I've recently learned the truth was more complicated. I would appreciate the chance to speak with someone who understands what this feels like." Within an hour, she'd responded, "Olivia, I'm so sorry for your loss. The lies are almost worse than the death itself, aren't they? I'd be happy to talk. Here's my number." We spoke for 2 hours. Patricia's experience was both similar to and different from mine. She'd eventually learned the truth about her husband's heroic death, but only after years of confusion and anger. What struck me most was her description of the isolation. She felt unable to properly grieve because she didn't understand what she was grieving. "The worst part," she said, "wasn't just the lies. It was how the lies affected everyone around me. People thought Tom had died in a stupid accident, a mistake, something preventable. They treated his death like a tragedy but not like a sacrifice. I couldn't explain why I was so proud of him, along with being devastated, because I didn't know what he'd actually done." "How did you finally learn the truth?" Another SEAL, someone who'd been on the mission with Tom, tracked me down years later. He couldn't stand knowing that Tom's family didn't understand what kind of man he'd been, what kind of death he'd died. "Like General Morrison," I murmured. "Exactly like that. These men who serve with our husbands, they understand honor and sacrifice in ways that bureaucrats don't. They know that some things matter more than classification levels. After we hung up, I felt less alone but more determined. Patricia had eventually found peace, but only after years of unnecessary suffering caused by official deception. I wasn't going to wait years to honor Marcus's memory properly. I had spent the rest of the evening documenting everything I knew: the classified documents, the witness statements, the Iranian commendation, the news coverage, Patricia's story, and others like it. I was building a case, though I wasn't yet sure what court I'd be presenting it to. What I did know was that my children's dismissive attitude toward my grief was based on incomplete information about who their father had been. If they understood the truth about Marcus's death, if they grasped the magnitude of his sacrifice, surely they would understand why losing him had shattered me so completely. Surely they would realize that a man who died saving 30 lives deserved more than 3 months of polite mourning before his widow was expected to move on. Jennifer called the next morning, her voice sharp with the tone she used when managing her various charity committees. "Mom, David told me about your conversation yesterday. I think you owe him an apology." "Do I?" "Yes, you do. He's concerned about you, we all are, and you attacked him for trying to help." I was looking at Jennifer's Facebook page on my laptop, scrolling through photos from her recent charity gala designer dress. Perfectly styled hair, champagne glass raised in celebration. The event had been 2 weeks after Marcus's funeral. "Jennifer, I'm looking at pictures from your Save the Children fundraiser. Beautiful event, thank you. It raised over $50,000 for education programs in developing countries. Education programs, like the ones your father built." A pause. "What your father built?" 43 schools in 7 countries. I spent yesterday reading thank you letters from principals and teachers whose students have access to education because of his work. "Mom, what does this have to do with it?" "Has everything to do with everything. You've raised money for education programs, while telling your father's widow to get over grieving a man who actually built the schools. Your charity talks about funding. That's completely different, is it? You spent more energy planning one party than you've spent supporting me through the worst loss of my life. You've posted 12 times on social media about various causes while sending me exactly 2 text messages since the funeral." I could hear her breathing change, could picture her in her pristine kitchen, probably mentally calculating how to end this conversation quickly. "Mom, this isn't healthy. You're keeping track of my social media posts. That's not normal behavior." "What's not normal, Jennifer, is a daughter who can organize fundraisers for strangers' children while ignoring her own mother's grief. What's not normal is treating your father's death like an inconvenience that's keeping you from your real life." "I never said Dad's death was an inconvenience. You said I was embarrassing the family. You threatened to limit my access to my grandchildren if I didn't snap out of it. You compared me unfavorably to other widows who handled it better." Silence. "You want to know what your father would think about that, Jennifer? He'd be heartbroken. The man who spent his life helping people in crisis would be devastated to know his daughter responded to his wife's crisis with threats and judgment." "Mom, I think you need professional help. I think you need to examine your conscience. Your father died protecting children, and his daughter can't manage basic compassion for his widow." I hung up and immediately blocked her number. For the first time in months, I felt something like relief. The knock on my door came at 8 that evening. Robert stood on my porch holding a manila folder, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. "Mom, we need to talk." I let him in, noticing how he looked around the house, as if seeing it for the first time, more as if appraising it. "David and Jennifer are worried about you," he began. "After those phone calls, I'm sure they are." He sat down across from me and opened the folder. "Mom, I've been looking into Dad's financial situation, trying to help you get organized." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What do you mean, looking into it?" "His pension, the life insurance, Social Security benefits. You're going to have more money than you need, especially in this big house by yourself." I stared at him. "More money than I need. I've done the calculations. Dad's military pension, the humanitarian organization's life insurance, your own retirement savings. You're looking at over $8,000 a month in income. That's excessive for someone living alone." "Excessive." Robert pulled out a spreadsheet, apparently oblivious to my tone. "I've found some really nice assisted living facilities, much more appropriate for someone your age, especially someone dealing with grief-related mental health issues. Grief-related mental health issues. Mom, your behavior lately, the obsession with Dad's work files, the confrontational phone calls, blocking Jennifer's number suggests you're not thinking clearly. An assisted living community would provide social interaction, mental health, support, structured activities. I looked at the spreadsheet he'd prepared. Monthly costs, amenities, distance from family. He'd put considerable time into this research. Robert, who asked you to research assisted living facilities? No one asked me. I'm trying to help. And honestly, the extra money could really help my business. I'm expanding the consulting firm and the startup costs. You want my money. I want what's best for you. And if that also helps me provide better for my family, isn't that what Dad would want? I felt something break inside my chest, not grief this time, but pure rage. Your father died protecting other people's children. His youngest son wants to steal his widow's money and put her in a home. That's not what this is. Get out. Mom, get out of my house right now, and don't come back until you remember whose son you're supposed to be. I called General Morrison the next morning, my hands shaking with anger and disbelief. General, I need to ask you something. When Marcus wrote that letter, asking you to tell me the truth about his death, did he say anything about his children? A pause. What's happened? Mrs. Wilson, I told him about the conversations with David and Jennifer, about Robert's financial scheme, about their complete dismissal of both my grief and their father's legacy. I see, he said quietly. Mrs. Wilson, would you be comfortable if I paid your children a visit? What do you mean? I mean that sometimes people need to understand the full context of a situation before they can respond appropriately. Your children seem to be operating under the assumption that their father was a nice man who died an ordinary death. They don't understand what you've lost. But the classification, there are ways to convey truth without compromising operational security. Would you like me to speak with them? Yes, I said without hesitation. Yes, I would. I'll need their contact information. And Mrs. Wilson, there's something else Marcus asked me to tell you. If his family ever made you feel unsupported. What? He said that if his children ever failed to honor his memory or care for his wife properly, you had his permission to share his story with anyone who would listen. He said some truths matter more than bureaucratic convenience. That afternoon, General Morrison visited each of my children. I don't know exactly what he told them, but David called me that evening. Mom, I'm sorry. I had no idea. No idea about what Dad actually did, about Iran, about how he died. The general told you. Enough. Enough to realize that we've been completely wrong about everything. Mom, why didn't you tell us? Because you didn't ask. Because you were too busy managing my grief to be interested in understanding it. I'm so sorry. Are you, David? Or are you just embarrassed that a stranger had to explain to you who your father was? He was quiet for a long time. Both, I think. That's honest, at least. What can I do to make this right? Start by treating your father's memory with the respect it deserves, and stop treating his widow like a problem to be solved. General Morrison's visits had shaken my children, but I realized that shame and embarrassment weren't the same as understanding. If they were going to truly comprehend who Marcus had been, they needed to see the full scope of his impact. I decided to organize a proper memorial service. The first person I called was Dr. Sarah Chen, the camp administrator whose witness statement I'd read in the classified file. General Morrison had provided me with her contact information, along with permission to reach out. Mrs. Wilson, she said, when I explained who I was, I've been hoping to speak with you for months. Your husband was extraordinary. I'm planning a memorial service to honor Marcus properly. Would you be willing to attend? Of course. There are others who would want to come as well, people whose lives he touched. Colleagues who understood his character. Over the next 2 weeks, I contacted everyone I could find who had worked with Marcus over the years. Former military colleagues, humanitarian organization staff, local officials from countries where he'd served. The response was overwhelming. Colonel James Harrison, who had served with Marcus in Rwanda. Marcus Wilson was the finest man I ever served with. I'll fly in from anywhere to honor his memory. Dr. Maria Santos, who had worked with Marcus in Kosovo. Your husband saved my life during a mortar attack. He threw himself over 3 of us when the shells started falling. I never got to thank him properly. Ahmed Hassan, a translator who had worked with Marcus in Afghanistan. Mr. Wilson learned enough of our language to speak directly with village elders. He always treated local people with dignity and respect. He was a bridge between worlds. I contacted the Iranian consulate, explaining that I wanted to honor an American who had died protecting Iranian refugees. After several phone calls and much back and forth, they agreed to send a representative. I also reached out to Patricia Martinez and other families. I'd connected with online people who understood the unique grief of losing someone to classified operations. The memorial service was scheduled for a Saturday at the community center where Marcus and I had attended town halls and civic meetings for decades. I arranged for full military honors, something that should have happened at his original funeral. As word spread, more people contacted me. Teachers from schools Marcus had helped build, medical professionals from clinics he'd established, refugees whose lives he'd directly saved. I began to understand that I hadn't just lost a husband. The world had lost a humanitarian whose impact stretched across continents and generations. The morning of the memorial service, I stood in my bedroom holding the folded American flag that had been draped over Marcus's casket. I'd kept it in the closet since the funeral, unable to display it because I hadn't understood what it truly represented. Now I knew. This flag had honored a man who died protecting innocent children, a hero whose sacrifice had been buried under diplomatic necessities. The community center was packed. Over 200 people had come to honor Marcus' military colleagues, humanitarian workers, local officials, refugees he'd helped, and families affected by classified operations. My children sat in the front row, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief and shock as they began to comprehend their father's true legacy. General Morrison delivered the opening remarks. Marcus Wilson died as he lived, putting others before himself. His final act of courage saved 30 lives and prevented an international incident that could have harmed thousands more. Dr. Sarah Chen spoke about Marcus's last day, when the intelligence came in about potential threats. Most international staff evacuated. Marcus volunteered to stay and coordinate civilian protection. When the moment came, he didn't hesitate. He used his own body to shield children from the blast. The Iranian consulate representative, Mr. Rashid Durrani, presented a formal letter of gratitude. The Islamic Republic of Iran recognizes Marcus Wilson as a hero who transcended national boundaries to protect innocent life. His sacrifice represents the highest ideals of humanitarian service. Colonel Harrison shared stories from their military service. Marcus never sought recognition. He did what needed to be done because it needed doing. That's why none of you knew the full scope of his heroism. He never talked about it. Ahmed Hassan spoke in accented English. Mr. Wilson treated every person with dignity, regardless of nationality or religion. He showed us that Americans and Muslims could work together for peace. As person after person shared their memories and gratitude, I watched my children's faces transform. David wiped tears as he listened to stories he'd never heard. Jennifer sat stunned as refugees described how her father's work had saved their families. Robert looked physically ill as he realized the magnitude of what he'd tried to dismiss. The honor guard presented me with a flag. On behalf of a grateful nation and the children of the world who are alive today because of Marcus Wilson's sacrifice. In that moment, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by my husband's service, I finally understood the full scope of what I'd lost and why my grief was not just personal, but sacred. After the memorial service, my children followed me home in their separate cars. I could see them in my rearview mirror, David and Jennifer talking intensely, Robert driving alone with his head down. In my living room, surrounded by condolence, flowers and cards from people around the world, we sat in uncomfortable silence until David finally spoke. "Mom, I need to apologize. We all do." He pulled out a handwritten letter, his hands shaking slightly. "I wrote this last night, after everything General Morrison told us, after understanding what the memorial service meant." He cleared his throat. "Dear Mom, I'm ashamed of how I've treated you since Dad's death. I reduced your grief to an inconvenience, and your love to an embarrassment. I didn't understand who Dad really was, or what you'd lost." Jennifer's letter was shorter, but more emotional. "I thought I knew what heroism looked like: charity, galas, and fundraising events. I had no idea it looked like a man throwing his body over children to save their lives. I'm sorry for my cruelty, Mom. I'm sorry for not seeing your strength." Robert's apology was the hardest to hear. "I tried to steal from a hero's widow. I wanted to put you in a home so I could take Dad's money. I don't know how to live with that shame. but I'm going to try to become the son he raised me to be. I looked at these 3 people I'd brought into the world, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time since Marcus's death. They were flawed, selfish in the way that comfortable people often are, but they weren't beyond redemption. Your father loved you, I said quietly, all of you, but love doesn't excuse cruelty, and good intentions don't erase harm done. What can we do? David asked. You can start by understanding that grief isn't a problem to be solved or a timeline to be managed. You can accept that your father was extraordinary and that losing him changed me permanently, and you can decide whether you want to honor his memory through your actions or continue disappointing it through your selfishness. Jennifer reached for my hand. Will you forgive us? I'll forgive you when you've earned it. And you'll earn it by becoming the kind of people your father believed you could be. David nodded. We want to help with whatever you're planning next. What makes you think I'm planning something? Because, Robert said quietly, your dad's wife, and now we know what that means. 6 months after the memorial service, I stood in the offices of the Marcus Wilson Foundation, watching volunteers stuff envelopes with information packets for families affected by classified military operations. What had started as an idea born from grief had become a lifeline for people around the country who were struggling with incomplete information about their loved ones' deaths. Patricia Martinez had become my co-director, bringing her experience and network of military families. Dr. Sarah Chen served on our board, helping us understand the unique needs of humanitarian workers' families. Even some of my children had found ways to contribute meaningfully. David used his legal expertise to help families navigate bureaucratic systems. Jennifer organized fundraising events that actually served a purpose beyond social networking. Robert had surprised me most of all. He'd closed his consulting business and dedicated himself full-time to the foundation, saying he needed to find a way to honor his father's memory through service rather than profit. The foundation's work was simple, but revolutionary. We connected families of classified operation casualties with resources, support networks, and when possible, the truth about their loved ones' service. We lobbied for policy changes that would allow more disclosure to grieving families. We provided grief counseling specifically designed for people dealing with incomplete information about traumatic losses. Most importantly, we ensured that heroes like Marcus weren't forgotten just because their stories were classified. I was reviewing grant applications when my assistant knocked on my door. Mrs. Wilson, there's someone here to see you. Says he's from the Iranian consulate. Mr. Tarani entered, carrying a small package. Mrs. Wilson, I have something for you from the families at the refugee camp. Inside was a handmade quilt, each square sewn by a different family Marcus had helped save. In the center, embroidered in English and Farsi, were the words, "For the wife of our hero." They wanted you to know, Mr. Tarani said, that they think of you as family. Your husband's sacrifice created bonds that transcend borders. I traced the careful stitching with my fingers, thinking about grief and love and the way pain could transform into purpose. There's something else, he continued. The children Marcus saved, they're thriving. They attend school now. They're healthy. They're safe. Zara, the 4-year-old, draws pictures of the American angel who protected her. They all know his name. That evening, I sat in Marcus's study, no longer avoiding it but finding comfort there among his books and maps and memories of a life dedicated to service. I pulled out the final letter he'd written before leaving for Iran, the one I'd found in his desk drawer after his death. My darling Olivia, it began. If you're reading this, then the worst has happened. But I need you to know it was worth it. 1 year after Marcus's death, I stood at his grave reading the rest of his final letter aloud. The words he'd written knowing he might not come home. My darling Olivia, if you're reading this, then the worst has happened. But I need you to know it was worth it. Every mission, every risk, every moment away from you was justified if it meant someone else's children got to go home safely. I know you'll grieve, and you should. Grieve fully, completely, without apology or timeline. Don't let anyone tell you that love has an expiration date or that missing me is a weakness. Your grief is the other side of our love, and our love was the greatest accomplishment of my life. I also know you'll eventually find a way to transform that grief into something meaningful. You always do. You'll discover strength you didn't know you had, and you'll use it to help people who need what only you can give. Our children will disappoint you at first. They're comfortable, and comfortable people don't always understand sacrifice or loss. but they're good people underneath, raised with good values. When they finally understand who I was, they'll also understand who you are, and they'll become the adults we always hoped they'd be. Don't be afraid to tell my story, Olivia. Don't let bureaucrats and diplomats decide that some truths are too dangerous for the world to know. Heroes shouldn't die in silence, and widows shouldn't grieve in isolation. Most importantly, don't just survive losing me. Live beyond it. Find new purpose, new joy, new ways to serve the world we both love. I didn't save those children so you could spend the rest of your life being sad I'm gone. I saved them so their lives and your life could continue to matter. I love you beyond words, beyond time, beyond death itself. Honor that love by living fully, by refusing to be diminished by loss, by showing the world that some things, love, sacrifice, truth, justice, matter more than convenience or comfort. You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more necessary than you understand. The world needs Olivia Wilson. I always knew that. Now it's time for you to know it too. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in my purse. Around me, the foundation volunteers were setting up for our annual memorial service, honoring not just Marcus, but all the classified heroes whose families had found their way to us. As I watched them work, David coordinating logistics, Jennifer managing media relations, Robert comforting a newly widowed spouse, I realized that Marcus had been right about everything. Our children had become the adults we'd raised them to be. My grief had transformed into purpose, and his story, once buried in classified files, was now helping families around the world understand that their losses mattered, their grief was sacred, and their heroes deserved to be remembered. The truth, as Marcus had always believed, had set us all free.